Okay, so for the next 3 weeks or so, we are going to be looking at the road to the American Civil War, the age of sectional crisis that gripped the country between 1850 and 1861. So, when we talk about a sectional crisis and sectionalism, it means loyalty or support for one particular region or section of the nation rather than for the United States as a whole. And that's what you're going to see increasing during this time. Increasingly, people, especially in the South and to some extent in the North as well, talking more and more about kind of these two regions not being able to coexist in the same country and potentially breaking apart. It's an idea that really grew throughout the 1850s to the point where America is going to fight the Civil War between North and South in 1861. So, as we look at the unit, two big questions to think about. First of all, to what extent did differing opinions on slavery, as well as the institution's expansion, cause the events that led to the Civil War? So, how did slavery lead to the Civil War? And was the Civil War inevitable or unavoidable? Was this something that was kind of destined to happen from the beginning, this conflict over slavery in the United States? Or was it not? Couldn't you imagine of some kind of alternate history where the Civil War doesn't happen between North and South? So those are the two big questions to contemplate. So basically, between 1845 and 61, the nation grew increasingly divided as it struggled to answer difficult questions regarding slavery. In this unit, the students will consider the debate between Northerners and Southerners over the spread of slavery into the West, and we'll look at the content and effectiveness of various compromises, along with increasing acts of violence over this issue of slavery during the time. In 1860, voters elected Abraham Lincoln, a member of the anti-slavery Republican Party, to be the next president of the United States. And not this week, but in a couple weeks, we'll look at how this event, the election of Lincoln, led to the secession, or the breaking away, of southern states from the Union and triggered the Civil War. So that's kind of big picture where we're going here. Okay. This week, we're looking at two events that kind of set off this era of sectional crisis. The first is actually an attempt at a political compromise, the Compromise of 1850, between Northern and Southern congressmen. And this big political compromise, it had a bunch of different parts, but it basically deals with the issue of slavery's expansion after the Mexican-American War. So, got all this new territory. Will it be free or slave? And as part of that compromise, we're going to pay special attention to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. As part of the compromise, Congress passed a new Fugitive Slave Act to assist Southern slave owners in capturing escaped slaves in the North. It was tougher than previous fugitive slave acts, and you'll see why. This law was highly controversial in the North, and in general, the Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Act are things that are supposed to kind of make the situation cool down, but actually cause it to heat up. Okay, so quickly just overviewing what's going on in the North and South in the 1800s. We talked a bit about this, but it's worth reviewing. So remember, in the North, you have more cities, more industry, factories being built up, large population of wage laborers working in the factories, many of whom are newly arrived immigrants or relatively new to the country. So the society is a pretty diverse society. Cities like New York and Philadelphia are full of kind of immigrants from different parts of Europe who are drawn to the opportunities in America. And most immigrants come to the North. It's seen as kind of more opportunities. The North is generally has a better education system, more public education, so they have a higher literacy rate, and again, a larger population of immigrants. So that's some of the basic kind of economic, social differences in general. In the South, on the other hand, it's much more rural. There's not as many big cities. It's more agrarian, meaning it relies more on farming for the economy. There's a few factories scattered about, but mainly an agrarian economy. The main crop is, again, king cotton, and the southern economy, the cotton economy, is very reliant on slavery. By 1860, going to be about 4 million, or a third of the southern population is going to be enslaved. The South is not diverse in terms of immigrants. Again, most immigrants go to the North, where it's easier to find kind of entry level factory jobs to make a wage. South does not invest really in public education, so that's another difference in terms of the literacy and education level. And there's less people in the South. There's not as many big cities, not as many immigrants, so there's fewer people who live in the South. Here's a map of slavery. By 1860, you can see slavery basically has disappeared from the northern territories, but is bigger than ever in the South. So growing in the South, but basically disappearing in the North. A map of cotton production in the South, along with some other crops. And you can see that cotton was the main kind of economic staple in the South. Okay, so in general, in the North, how do people feel about slavery? There's not really hardly any slavery in the North. There's a handful of slaves still in the North by 1860, and that's an interesting topic. Like, what was going on with those people? But in general, slavery's basically disappeared. That doesn't mean that racism has disappeared. Northerners, white Northerners, generally, the majority would still have racist views, that African American people are inferior and should not have equal rights. So there's a difference between slavery and racism, right? You can have racism without slavery. Most people in the North did not interact much with African Americans, and the abolitionists are relatively a minority of people in the North. So there's not really that many people who are standing up and saying, slavery is wrong, blacks and whites should be equal. They were a minority of people who stood up and said that, even though in hindsight we recognize them as kind of the heroes of this time. But not every Northerner shared their views. Okay. Meanwhile, in the South, they really can't conceive, or most Southerners can't really conceive of Southern society or economy without slavery. It's something that they've come to accept as kind of an essential part of the South. And again, speaking generally about Southerners here, there's obviously some who don't feel this way, but generally this is the widespread view in the South. Slavery was thought in the South to be justified by religion. Southerners interpreted the Bible to say black people should be servants for white people, focusing on those pro-slavery parts of the Bible. And you even hear the argument in the South that, well, wage labor is actually worse than slave labor because in the factories, people have to go home and pay their own rent and pay for their own food, and slave owners provide all that for their slaves. So there's kind of this myth that the South pushes that, no, the slaves are happy, we take care of them, sort of this paternalist relationship of we're taking care of them. And it's not true, but it was the kind of common argument you'd hear coming out of the South. Okay, so in 1850, there is growing debate over slavery's expansion into the West. A growing number of, quote, free soilers in the West and the North wanted to keep slavery out of the West. Not anti-slavery in the sense that free soilers didn't necessarily think, we need to go to the South and stop slavery, but they wanted to keep it out of the West. They wanted the West to be open to free labor. They didn't want to have to compete with slave plantations that would make it very hard for, an independent farmer to compete. So that free soilers want to keep slavery out, and pro-slavery forces want to try to expand slavery into the West to make new slave states. Remember, there's this constant tension over one side or the other getting a majority in Congress. It's seen as potentially dangerous to either side for one side to get a majority of states in Congress. The abolition movement, again, is in the minority, but is growing in terms of its visibility and its influence on the public and on politics during this time. On the other hand, in the South, cotton production is booming. And the South is economically and socially reliant on slavery. By 1860, 4 million people enslaved, about 33%, a third of the South's total population. And on top of this, new territory added from the Mexican War again raises the issue of whether or not slavery is going to expand. So remember, after Mexican-American War, all of this new territory enters the Union, and it's kind of the big question is slavery going to be allowed in these territories? Now, keep in mind, in 1820, a very similar issue arose in Congress with the addition of Missouri. Again, this was a new state that they were worried was going to upset the balance between slave and free states, but to stave off a political crisis about this, they come up with the Missouri Compromise. They let Missouri in as a slave state. Maine comes in as a free state, and they draw this line across the map, dividing kind of northern areas where slavery won't be allowed and southern areas where it will. But of course, California is, on both sides of the line. So that line kind of breaks down in terms of its usefulness, and they need to find a new compromise. 1850, here's a kind of who's who of Congress in 1850. The big political questions in 1850, would the newly acquired territory in the West be open to slavery, particularly California, because the gold rush had caused so many people to rush into California that it was ready to become a state almost right away. You were supposed to have 60,000 people in your territory for it to be admitted as a state, and California hits that within like a year or two of joining the Union. So it really, the gold rush really presses this whole issue. There has been in the South outrage that many fugitive slaves have escaped to the North, and the Southerners feel like Northerners are not helping them return their quote-unquote property, these human beings who have escaped slavery. So the South wants the North to be more active in helping them return fugitive slaves. So both sides, have really strong opinions, and should they compromise, right? Should the free states compromise with the slave states? Is it ever right to compromise over an issue like slavery? Are there some times when, politicians and people should not compromise, even if it means a political crisis? So here is the compromise they work out in 1850 to kind of quiet this growing crisis. So California comes in as a free state. There was never really any question about that because, California didn't really have hardly any slaves. Most people there supported free statehood. But in New Mexico and Utah, popular sovereignty would decide whether or not there was slavery. That means people would be able to take a vote on whether or not to allow slavery in their territory. So this kind of cancels the Missouri Compromise. Now we're just saying states on either side of the line can vote and decide. Texas gave up claims to New Mexico for 10 million, so New Mexico can be a separate state. Texas gets a little smaller. In Washington, D.C., the slave trade is abolished. One of the biggest slave markets in the country actually used to be just a few blocks down from the Capitol. But the slave trade, buying and selling, is canceled in Washington, D.C., sort of as a sop to the anti-slavery folks. But slavery's still allowed in Washington, D.C. And we get a new fugitive slave law that has much more teeth and is much tougher than previous fugitive slave laws. Now they're saying, with this new law, citizens need to actually help find and return runaway slaves. And if you are helping runaway slaves, then you could actually be fined or imprisoned for helping people escape slavery. Here's a map that's useful to look at. Remember, California is in as a free state. Utah territory and New Mexico territory, they're going to get to vote this idea of popular sovereignty on whether or not to allow slavery. So a little more about this new Fugitive Slave Act, because again, this is one of those things that is supposed to kind of appease the South and kind of quiet things down, calm things down, but actually just creates even more controversy. So according to this new law, citizens need to help find and return runaway slaves. That is, if you are in the North, you can be deputized and actually kind of commanded to help find runaway slaves in your community. Again, if you help runaway slaves, if you help them seek freedom or shelter them, you could be fined or even thrown in jail. So helping them find sanctuary becomes illegal. The police and the slave catchers that were commissioned by this law really were just acting on the word of slave owners. So slave owners would provide a description of, this is the person, this is some of their features, and this is when they got away, this is where we think they are. And then they would go out and try to find these people. And there was federal commissioners appointed, basically judges, special judges that would hear the cases of people who were accused of being escaped slaves. They would go before these federal commissioners. And the federal commissioners were actually paid more for returning a slave than freeing them. So there's actually a financial incentive for these commissioners to find more people to be escaped. So this is not a neutral court. The whole system is basically rigged against escaped slaves, or even people who weren't escaped slaves but just had the bad luck of being caught and accused of being escaped slaves. There's actually free people who get caught up in all this and enslaved for the first time. The reaction to this in the North is anger and outrage for the most part. People feel like now they're being forced to support slavery. So even people who had kind of taken a back seat and said, well, it's a Southern problem, well, this new law really puts it at their doorstep, because now they kind of have to help. They have to play a part in catching slaves if they're deputized. Not really sure how often that happened, but the idea that you could be forced to help capture escaped slaves and that it was illegal to help them went against the beliefs and sensibilities of many Northerners who may not have really thought much or cared much about slavery in the South, but now they care about this Fugitive Slave Act. African American people are outraged and terrified by this law, free people as well as escaped slaves, and they feel, very defenseless anywhere in the North. And many people actually go to Canada, because Canada at this time with the new act becomes kind of the only place that is, totally safe from you being kind of captured and returned to slavery. So the Compromise of 1850 works for now, but creates new problems later, and not really that much later, like within a few years. The consequences of this whole thing, again, white Northerners are furious, black Northerners are outraged and scared. In the South, people become frustrated that the North still is not cooperating. So the South, uses this fuels sectionalism in the South, because people say, well, the North does not really have any interest in supporting, us and getting back our quote unquote property. So the South says, we can't work with these people. They are going against our interests in every turn. They're not following the law, right? The Fugitive Slave Act is the law. It's not a just law, but it's a law. And people in the South, say the North is more interested in breaking the law and helping slaves than following the law and, doing their duty to return them to us. And in Massachusetts, Daniel Webster, the big New England senator, really just gets slammed for his support for the compromise. And we see in Massachusetts and New England kind of a new generation of more openly abolitionist politicians like Charles Sumner rising up. People start voting more for people who are openly abolitionist. And that's going to fuel sectional tension as well. The Underground Railroad is more active than ever during this time, when more secrecy is needed to get escaped slaves, not just to the North, but now to Canada, right? Follow the North Star. And so this is really the peak time of the Underground Railroad, ironically, because the Fugitive Slave Act is supposed to make it harder, but actually it just increases the activism of the Underground Railroad. People also fought back violently against slave catchers. In 1851, in Christiana, Pennsylvania, a group of free African Americans tried to protect fugitive slaves from their master who would come north to get them back. After a fight, the slave owner is actually killed, and a number of white bystanders are there but do not intervene. They refuse to help the slave owner get back his slave. So a slave owner is actually killed over this just a year after the law is passed. Another famous case is Anthony Burns. This is a Massachusetts case. Burns was an escaped slave living in Boston who was seized and ordered back to slavery, and this caused massive eruptions in Boston. People gathered around the courthouse and killed a guard and tried in their effort to free Anthony Burns, who was being held in the courthouse in Boston. President Franklin Pierce was determined to prove that the fugitive slave law would be upheld, even in Boston, not withheld, that should say upheld. So the president says, we have to have people following the law. And Burns is actually eventually captured and brought back to slavery, although I think he was later, his freedom was purchased and he was freed. The whole Anthony Burns story is a really interesting story. But what you start to see happening in the wake of all this is abolitionist lawmakers start passing laws in northern states forbidding the use of state jails to incarcerate alleged fugitives. So in the North, they start passing what's called personal liberty laws, basically saying that this state and the people of this state will not cooperate in returning fugitive slaves. It's for these reasons that the fugitive slave law doesn't actually result in that many people being kidnapped and brought back into slavery because there was so much resistance to it. Doesn't mean the law wasn't important, but it was really hard to enforce. You also see at this time the growth of anti-slavery literature, particularly the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Harriet Beecher Stowe was inspired to write after seeing slavery and learning about the Fugitive Slave Act. She wrote this novel that was an anti-slavery novel, and that became a huge bestseller in the U.S. and England. And it, was a story that was, even though it's dated now to read it, at the time, it was seen as very compassionate towards slaves and opened a lot of people's eyes up to slavery. The same way a popular book or movie today might raise people's social awareness about the issue. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the biggest book of the day. It was banned in the South, and actually in the South you start to see kind of, Uncle Phil's Shack and like other kind of responses to the book that are like Uncle Tom's Cabin, except the slaves are happy and they're not running away. But the Southern literature was never really taken seriously in the North, and not nearly as popular as Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is like best-selling book of the day, got turned into a play, so then people saw it that way as well. So just this whole time, despite the compromise, tensions are really increasing throughout the United States, and sectionalism is increasing over this issue of slavery and its expansion, the new fugitive slave law. So that's just kind of the first couple years of the 1850s.